Perfection is one of the great cliches in sport. Everybody's heard, perfect practice makes perfect or practice makes perfect. And there's often a lot of discussion about how to make a player perfect or how to execute perfectly or how can we play the perfect game. When all these things we know are unattainable. I don't think anybody realistically expects any player to be perfect in any one skill or in any one game or for any length of time. Even the best shooters in the world in game situations make 50% of their shots. Even in practice, they're not perfect. Even in undefended situations, they're probably shooting in the 70, 80, 90%, but they're not perfect. So if we acknowledge that we don't really expect the outcome to be perfect, that we acknowledge that there are going to be missed shots, there are going to be turnovers in a game, then what are we talking about in terms of perfection? And so instead, oftentimes we key in on the perfect technique. And we need to do something over and over until the performance of that skill is perfect. But what is a perfect skill execution? So does every basketball player shoot the same way? Do the best players shoot the same way? Is there a perfect shooting technique? Dribbling moves. Is there one way to do a crossover through the legs dribble or a behind the back? Is there just one perfect way? Or are there many different ways, and how we're going to use that skill is ultimately going to be dependent on who's using the skill, who are they playing against, and then the defense or who their location on the court, proximity of defenders, so on and so forth. And I think a lot of people will key in on, we need to have a perfect pass. So we need to have a perfect, follow through, thumbs point to the ground, two hands, use each hand equally, chest pass. But how often do we really use that pass during a game? And is it worth the time in practice that we spend to try to create this perfect execution of a skill that's only going to be used rarely in games? Or should we spend more time worrying about, can we actually complete a pass against defensive players in a live situation under time and space constraints? Because ultimately it's the outcome that we're trying to get to be correct or that we're trying to improve, not as much the technique. Ultimately, if you have a player who can make 50% of three-pointers, as a coach, you probably wouldn't care if he was shooting them backwards if he could make 50%. It's the outcome that we're more worried about. You'd be crazy to tell him to stop shooting backwards if he could make 50%. No, you have to do it this perfect way, where he may or may not be able to shoot, the same type of percent. If a player can throw underhanded passes and complete them, does it matter that he's throwing or she's throwing underhanded passes instead of a perfect two-hand chest pass? If a player is better or can make a layup, goofy foot layup, does it matter that it's not a perfect layup in terms of how we imagine the perfect technique of a layup to be? So again, this idea of perfection, we know that the outcome is never going to be perfect. And while we can say that we're striving towards perfection, we know that we're always going to come up short of that, that nobody's going to be perfect. And so if we create these expectations that we have to be perfect or that we're going to do something until it's perfect, what are we really focusing on? I do think that there is some room in practice to kind of move towards this idea of perfection. So I know when I was young, our coach, when I was in sixth grade, our coach started practice and we had to make 20 layups in a row as a team on the right-hand side and then 20 layups in a row from the left-hand side. So in a sense, that is trying to get perfect practice, at least in a very small number of reps. Basically, it's each player making 2 layups on each side. And it's effective for a couple of reasons. One, the consequence really did keep us concentrating, and every shot meant something because nobody wanted to let down the team and have us start over, because we wanted to get past this because we wanted to do the fun stuff in practice. We didn't want to spend our whole time doing layups because, as with every player, we thought it was beneath us. But the biggest thing that it did is it motivated us to practice our weak hand on our own, because we didn't want to be that player who missed the left-hand layup when we got to 18 or 19, and we'd done all this work and now we go in and we miss the layup. So we would practice on our own to be able to make these layups, and so we would get through it quicker and quicker in practice. And it wasn't because we were practicing it necessarily, it was because of what it motivated us to do outside. And so this to me is an example of how you can use this idea of being perfect, okay, or trying to be perfect for a small amount of time, to motivate players and to have a positive result. But while we were doing it, there was no, it didn't count as a miss if we didn't shoot it the right way. As long as we used our right hand on the right side and the left hand on the left side for the purpose of the drill, there was no kind of standard measurement. We weren't judged on our technique. It was, did you make the shot or not? We weren't, the technique wasn't a focus, it was the outcome. And presumably, the better technique that you use, the more likely you are to make the shot, but the better technique for an individual is going to be individual. So how I shoot a layup might be different than how somebody else shoots a layup. We're all going to have some similar features of our layup, because we're all essentially combating the same forces. So we're all shooting against gravity, more or less. We're all shooting with the same size ball, so the closer we are in terms of our strength levels and our size and so forth, the closer our technique is likely to get, because we have similar structures overcoming similar constraints. In youth basketball, where the disparity or the differences between players could be really great, you're going to see a wider variety of techniques, because that's what each individual needs to overcome that challenge. And so to try to limit those players into one singular perfect technique doesn't allow for the differences between players. So, it doesn't mean that this idea of perfection is wrong. I don't like the idea of perfect practice, because I believe that the easiest way to get perfect practice is to use a skill that is not a challenge for the players. So if I wanted to have perfect passing practice, I would take away the defense, and we'd just sit there and throw passes back and forth to each other. And if we're, let's say, high school players, we can probably do that without many turnovers. But is that going to make us better? We're perfect because we're doing something that we've already mastered. We're not doing something that's going to challenge us, or something that's going to stimulate learning or increase our abilities or teach us something new. So that's why I tend to stay away from the idea of perfect practice, or trying to be perfect or whatever, because I want to encourage some mistakes, and I want to challenge players, and by challenging players, they're going to make mistakes, and in making those mistakes, then we have an opportunity to improve. But if there's some instances where you're going to do a drill like we did with the layups, where you're trying to be perfect for a certain amount of time and there's a consequence and it has a purpose, great. But just using this idea of perfect, or focusing on one perfect technique, I think we're focusing on the wrong thing.